Today we're going to look at the empathy data that you all helped to create after playing Bury Me My Love. This presentation isn't just about what the data says, it's about how we got the numbers using our survey, what they mean, and what they tell us about games, emotions, and learning. So, as a class, we didn't just play the game, but we actually participated in this kind of mini research study, although like unofficial research study, but just to go through the process of seeing how you would measure and evaluate a game experience like this if you were to do something like this in your library or in a library program. And what I hope is by we as we reflect on these experiences that it'll really show us how we can use these types of interactive stories to teach empathy in a library setting. So why we collected the data. Let's start with the whole point is why do we do this? So the goal was to understand whether interactive storytelling, like the one in Bury Me My Love, can foster empathy. We also wanted to see how that empathy develops emotionally, intellectually, and morally. But this wasn't just about empathy, it's also about the process of research. So you got to experience what it's like to take a survey, to know that you're taking a survey based on something that we studied and played together. And I'm going to show you how I'm going to interpret the data from the survey into this kind of like small scale library and information science study. Remember, there's only 18 of us in this one. But this does process mirrors how librarians and information scientists evaluate a user experience, or how you would look at a literacy outcome or even engagement in a library program. So, how do you study empathy? To study empathy, we needed a survey that could measure it accurately. So, we started with validated empathy tools like the Interpersonal Reactivity Index and the QCAE, which is a questionnaire of cognitive and affective empathy. So these are used in psychology and education. And then we adapted them for Bury Me My Love so we could focus on four domains, which is cognitive empathy, affective empathy, fantasy or immersion, and reflection. So these categories help us understand how empathy happens, not just as a feeling, but as an interaction between thinking, feeling, and imagining. By answering the questions, you're part of this empathy measurement experiment designed specifically for gaming. And just keep that in mind. Anytime you're going to build a survey, you want to use questions from a survey that's already been validated, something that's already been created and done. So you're not just making up questions on your own, because that leads to a lot of times asking a question that you kind of already want the answer for, or you're asking a question in a way that you can get data that you need. But if you use these kind of verified surveys like the QCAE or even the reflexivity reactivity index, these questions have been used time and time again in different research studies, and it makes the questions useful, valuable, and validated so that we can consistently use these and measure them. That's why you'll notice when you were taking the survey, there were a couple of questions in there that had absolutely nothing to do with Bury Me My Love, but they were actually empathy checks and empathy measures within there so we can check the validity on how one thing relates to another. And we could take measurements based on the amount of the amount of value that you personally place on something like empathy versus your scores of empathy, and then we can do a co-relational cross-relational check. So this is how and why I built the survey like this. So the first one is the Interpersonal Reactivity Index. This is by Davis. This is all the way from 1983. And basically, it was developed as one of the most widely used tools to measure empathy. It defines empathy as a multi dimensional construct made up of cognitive and affective components within four distinct subscales. So you have perspective taking, which is your cognitive empathy, and that's the ability to adopt another person's psychological viewpoint and to understand their situation or feeling. So an example of this would be understanding why Nor makes difficult or dangerous choices sometimes. The empathetic concern or your affective empathy are feelings of sympathy and compassion for others in distress. So an example could be feeling worried or sad when Nor faces danger or uncertainty. And then we have fantasy or the imaginative identification. And that's a tendency to be able to place your imagination to project yourself into a fictional situation. And the example here would be feeling like you are part of Nora's story or imagining what you would do in her place. And then there's personal distress, which is a self focused emotional response. And that's when you have feelings of anxiety or feelings of discomfort in response to somebody else's suffering. And an example here would be feeling stressed or helpless when you can't guide Nora to safety. The next one is Green and Brock from 2000, and they introduced the concept of the narrative transportation. And that is basically describing what happens when you become deeply absorbed or transported into a story. So when you're transported, a reader or players in our case are temporarily you suspend your awareness of the real world and mentally enter the narrative world. And it's when you can imagine what a character feels or a character thinks and experiences. And remember, these weren't made for video games. These were initially made for reading. Reading and then later applied to film, and then now we're applying these to video games. But in this state of immersion for them, people experience vicarious emotions, so feeling what the character feels. They engage in mental stimulation, so imagining themselves in the character situation, and their beliefs and attitudes can shift because the story allows them to live someone else's perspective. Now, Ball and Veldkamp in 2013 expanded on the idea and provided some more empirical evidence to show that narrative transportation actually increases empathy. And they found that when readers are emotionally engaged and immersed in a narrative, they're more likely to experience emphatic concern. So, genuine feelings of compassion for others. Essentially, immersion serves as this bridge between understanding a story and feeling the emotional impact. In the context of games like Bury Me My Love, it means that players don't just observe Nora's journey, but you participate in it. And the text message format deepens immersion and encourages players to mentally simulate the emotional and physical journey. And thus, that would create empathy that's experiential rather than abstract because you're feeling it and you're living it. And that's why I thought it was important to talk about the survey, and the questions from the survey came from these previous surveys. So, moving from our responses to data. So, this is a screenshot of taking the data out of the Google form. So, right, we created this Google survey in a Google form, and then it creates this CVS data, and from there we take that comma value separated data CVS into Excel, and then from Excel I took that into a statistics program. So after you completed the survey, they were exported into the spreadsheet, and then I cleaned the data using SPSS, which is a statistical software package. And in it, I checked for missing answers, I standardized the scales, and then I calculated the averages and the means. And I used SPSS to really look at the correlations between each empathy domain. And this process, where you're turning responses into analyzable data, it's called data processing when we're looking at research. So you collect your data, which is getting you to fill out the survey, and then we process the data, which is trying to clean up the data and make it standardized so that we can actually run statistics on it. So once everything's organized, we can start asking questions like which kind of empathy was most activated by the game, and how do these forms of empathy connect to each other. So this is what some of the results look like in the empathy domain survey. So as a class, the highest scores were in affective empathy, averaging 4.32 out of 5. That means most of you felt emotionally connected to Nora's story. Then cognitive empathy, the ability to understand her situation, was also very high at 4.11. And then fantasy or immersion averaged 4.04, showing that many of you felt like you were inside of the story. And then reflection at 3.92 shows that you thought about what the game meant after you played, but that score wasn't nearly as high as the others. So the reflection aspect didn't really hit. But the fantasy, the cognitive, and the affective really did. But altogether, the results suggest that Bury Me My Love was not just an emotional experience, but it's also a intellectual one. And for a lot of you, it was a reflective one. And here's a bar graph of what the domain scores I think it might be easier to look at how high affective empathy scored. So let's look at the correlations between the domains. So you can see that there's a strong inter-domain correlation. 0.70 to 85, like 70 to 85% show that immersion in fantasy predicts both affective and reflective empathy. So the more immersed you are in the story, the more it shows that if you're immersed in the story, you're going to have an affective measure as well. And it's also, if you're immersed in a story, you're going to have a reflective empathy shown as well. And both of these align with the empathy literature, that narrative, transportation, and identification often mediate emotional and behavioral empathy outcomes. So let's look at some of the correlations between the domain. So fantasy affects the affective with a very high correlation of 0.8, which means that students who felt more immersed in the game also reported stronger emotional concern for the characters. And then fantasy also affects reflection, and reflection also affects fantasy. So immersion's tightly linked with reflective empathy. Those who felt in the story were more likely to report wanting to learn or act afterwards. The next one is cognitive and fantasy are both correlated. So perspective taking and imaginative identification both move together, which means that understanding the character's position often depends on the narrative transportation. So if you buy into the fantasy, if you let yourself come into it, then you really start understanding the position and the, let's say, ambiguity of some of the moral decisions that Noor has to make, that you fall more in line with that when you buy into the fantasy of what's happening. That's that narrative transportation. So affective and reflection are tied together as well. So emotional empathy translates into reflective or moral outcomes. Feeling compassion for the character tends to spark an ethical awareness and a social reflection. So those of you that felt a compassion towards the character typically had your ethical awareness change, where you may have gone out to look for resources about refugees, or started reading more about the game, or started reading more about the crisis. And then cognitive and affective are tied together pretty well too, which means that the cognitive understanding supports affective resonance. So when you comprehend the refugee situation, you seem to feel more emotionally engaged. So in short, I would say that the data shows a cohesive empathy network where immersion or fantasy acts as the bridge between understanding and feeling and reflection. So that's basically, fantasy acts as the bridge between your cognition, and then that helps you to feel and reflect further. So how does that, right, the survey results that we have align back with the theory? So within library and information science and media literacy, these results reinforce the findings by Betchen et al. That interactive narratives, by granting players agency and consequence, heighten perspective taking and ethical reflection. So the more engaged you are with the narrative, and by agency, we mean by you being able to have choices, and then consequences for the choices that you make, it really does heighten the perspective taking and then the ethical reflection that you have at the end. So collectively, the data suggests that Bury Me My Love not only evokes compassion for refugees, but also invites players to critically examine their own social positions and moral responsibilities. And I would say for graduate students preparing for a public-facing profession such as librarianship or education and archives, that this type of narrative-driven empathy may represent an effective pedagogical tool for cultivating things such as radical empathy, or engagement that moves beyond feeling towards understanding or wanting to become, not become, maybe take informed action after doing something. So let's look at the open-ended responses. These are the questions that you typed answers into. And I use something called thematic analysis. So I used a qualitative data analysis software tool called NVivo to create this thematic analysis. So thematic analysis is basically two coding structures that you use. One of them is called open coding, So you open code all the responses, which means I read all the responses. And as I read each line, I take um, themes that are important out of each sentence. And I try to combine them all into categories. So it's the process of reading the responses and then grouping similar statements together into what we call affinities. And then the more frequently an affinity is mentioned, it's kind of the more weight it's given in the next stage, which is your theoretical coding. So theoretical coding becomes a process of labeling the affinity. So we've grouped them all together, we've packed them all together, and now we want to call it something. And by calling it something, it lets us kind of achieve a clear understanding of all the data. So if we look at what we have, we had 18 total responses. So the theme emotional resonance, some of the emotions that you would write about was like helplessness or feeling compassion. That's obviously linked to the domain affective. The next theme would be perspective taking, where like 15 out of 18 of you talked about it. And that's talking about understanding or curiosity beyond the game. And that's linked to the cognitive aspect of empathy. Then 13 out of 18 of you talked about immersion and identification, which means being engaged directly in the game or feeling anxiety towards the game while you're playing it. And that's linked to fantasy. 12 out of 18, which this one kind of surprised me, the reflection and privilege that many of you mentioned feeling. So having gratitude towards your own kind of place in the world, or even awareness of your own privilege that you have by not having to live in, not having to be like this type of refugee situation. And that gets directly linked to the domain of reflection and empathy. And then 10 of you, a little more than half of you in the class, talked about the pedagogical insight, which is all of you validating this kind of interactive learning. That a lot of you saw this as kind of an effective way or an effective tool that you may want to use in your future work. And that links back to this idea of meta reflection. So we're going to take each one of these now and look at these. So we have, the 4 open-ended questions gave us 18 detailed reflections. And when we contextualize them into these quantitative trends, we get 5 dominant themes. And the themes, once again, are emotional resonance, cognitive perspective taking, immersion and identification, moral reflection, and pedagogical value of storytelling. So most participants described having vivid emotional reactions to the game's uncertainty and tension. So moments of separation, danger, and silence, particularly when Noor's fate became ambiguous, were frequently cited as gut-wrenching or even heartbreaking. So you will use language indicating embodied empathy, such as air quotes, "I felt what she felt," or "my heart sank." And that confirms the emotional arousal wasn't just peripheral, but it was central to the learning experience. And these responses corroborate the high affective empathy scores and resonate with Bateson's empathy altruism hypothesis that compassion can motivate moral concern. The next one was cognitive perspective taking. So the class also articulated heightened intellectual awareness of refugees' decision-making processes. Many of you described an appreciation for the moral ambiguity of migration choices and the absence of a right answer. One student said that safety isn't a single destination, but a constant negotiation. And those types of reflections illustrate a move from abstract sympathy to a situated understanding of what's happening. And that's precisely the kind of perspective taking that Davis identifies as cognitive empathy. So these accounts explain the strong correlation between cognitive and fantasy dimensions. And remember, that relationship was 0.84, as imaginative immersion facilitated more accurate mental modeling of others' lives. So the deeper you were in it, or the ability to appreciate the moral ambiguity really showed here as a cognitive domain. So let's look at immersion and identification or fantasy. So you frequently describe losing track of time or feeling responsible for Noor and checking your phones between sessions, or having signs of a deep narrative transportation. So the text message interface, you all mentioned that it blurred the boundary between fiction and reality, and it produced what I would say the people that study empathy would call emphatic engagement through simulation, going back to Botchin et al.'s 2012. And the fantasy immersive domain functions as a psychological bridge connecting your rational understanding with your emotional concern. So, roughly 2/3 of you mentioned thinking about your own privilege or your own safety in contrast to Nora's vulnerability. So, statements such as, it made me realize how much I take for granted, or I started reading real refugee stories afterwards, indicate a cognitive moral integration. And that's basic emotional empathy transitioning into a ethical reflection. And this aligns well with the quantitative correlation between affective and reflective empathy, which is a response of 0.71. And it also supports the claim that narrative games can spark radical empathy. And that's the empathy that moves from feeling to social consciousness. So finally, the class compared the impact of the game to traditional readings and nearly unanimously asserting that the interactive storytelling promotes deeper empathy. One of the quotes is that it's one thing to read about refugees, it's another to make choices that affect their survival. And these comments also echo Botchin et al.'s 2012 findings that digital simulations promote ethical reflection through agency and consequence. And that suggests that interactive narratives may surpass a text-only assignment in producing durable, emphatic understanding. So moving beyond doing something for an assignment, it seems like this actually made you think about refugee statuses or refugee journeys, and you may have even had conversations outside of the game with your peers about this. So just some closing thoughts. I think taken together, the quantitative and the qualitative data, it portrays a coherent empathy arc, which is that immersion leads to emotional connection, that leads to a cognitive insight, and then that leads to moral reflection. So the fantasy or the immersion dimension emerges as a mediating catalyst linking understanding, emotion, and ethical awareness. And the pattern models proposed by Green and Brock and then later validated by Ball and Velkamp in 2013, where transportation into a story world generates affective engagement, in turn broadens your social perspectives. So in Bury Me My Love, the player's imaginative entry into the refugee's lived experience created a cognitive comprehension and an emotional resonance. And both of those are core prerequisites for what the LIS field terms as information experience. So to wrap it up, our class demonstrated that digital stories can create immeasurable empathy. You not only played the game, but you also contributed to this kind of real data that shows how immersion and emotion lead to understanding and reflection. And you experience what it's like to participate and see your own kind of data interpreted in a research study. And that's one of the core skills in our LIS program is to understand the research process and to participate in the research process. So as you move forward, even as you get to your 709 classes, this might be the type of study you could do in 709, or this could also be the type of library research project you want to do for this class, a video game program proposal where you do this type of evaluation and measurement at the end. So think about how you can use empathy, data, and storytelling to design your own library programs so we can connect people and communities in meaningful ways. So thank you all for being a part of this project.